Chapter 15. Why is it glowing like that? Draz whispered. Maybe it's glad to see us, I replied. How was I supposed to know why it was glowing? Is it... Gotta put on the fan. Is it safe to touch that box? Algar asked shrewdly. I'm not sure, I replied. The orb itself is dangerous, but I don't know about the box. One of us is going to have to open it, Algar said. Torak could have put it here to trick us. For all we know, the box could be empty and the orb is someplace else. I knew who was supposed to open the box and take out the orb. The purpose that had brought us to this place had planted that piece of information in my head before we got here, but I also knew that it was going to have to be voluntary. I was going to have to nudge them a bit. The orb knows you, Balgrath, Chair told me. You do it. I shook my head. I'm not supposed to. There are other things I have to do, and whoever takes up the orb will spend the rest of his life guarding it. One of you gentlemen is going to have to do it. You decide who it's going to be, Cherrick said. I'm not permitted to do that. It's really very simple, Balgrath told me. We'll take turns trying to open the box. Whichever one doesn't die is the right one. No, I told him flatly. You've all got things that you're supposed to do, and dying here in Sithol Mishrak is not one of them. I squinted at the glowing box. I want you gentlemen to be absolutely honest about this. The orb's the most powerful thing in the world. Whichever one of you picks it up will be able to do anything, but the orb doesn't want to do just anything. It's got its own agenda, and if anybody tries to use it for something outside that agenda, it won't be happy. Torak already found that out. Examine your hearts, gentlemen. I need somebody who's not ambitious. I need somebody who will be willing to devote his whole life to guarding the orb without ever trying to use it. If the notion of having infinite power at your fingertips appeals to you in the slightest, you're not the one. That lets me out, Cherrick said with a slight shrug. I'm a king, and kings are supposed to be ambitious. The first time I got drunk, I'd have to try to do something with it. He looked at his sons. It's going to have to be one of you boys. I could probably keep a grip on my ambition, Drow said, but I think it ought to be somebody whose mind's quicker than mine. I can handle a fight, but thinking too much makes my head hurt. It was a brutally candid admission, and it raised my opinion of Dras considerably. Riva and Algar looked at each other, then Riva shrugged and smiled that boyish smile of his. Oh, well, he said, I haven't really got anything better to do anyway, and he reached out, opened the box, and took out the orb. Yes, the voice in my head exulted. Well, now, Algar said casually, since we've settled that, why don't we go? That's what really happened in Torak's tower. All that blather about evil intent in the Book of Aelorn was made up out of whole cloth by somebody who got carried away by his own creativity. I shouldn't really blame him for it, I guess. I do it all the time, myself. The real facts behind any story always seem sort of prosaic to me. Stick it inside your clothes someplace, I told Riva. It's a little excited right now, and that glow's awfully conspicuous. Oh, subchapter is the apostate. I think it's still the apostate. Won't I glow too? Riva asked dubiously, the way the box did, I mean. Try it and find out, I suggested. Does glowing hurt, he asked. I don't think so. Don't worry, Riva. The orb's very fond of you. It's not going to hurt you. Balgrath, it's a rock. How can it be fond of anything? It's not an ordinary rock. Just put it away, Riva, and let's get out of here. He swallowed hard and tucked the orb inside his fur excuse me, tunic. Then he held out one of his huge hands and examined it closely. No glow yet, he noted. See, you're going to have to learn to trust me, boy. You and I have a long way to go together, and it'll be difficult for both of us if you're going to ask me silly questions every time we turn around. Silly, he objected. After what it did to Torak, I don't think my questions were silly. Poor choice of terms, perhaps. Let's go. I had a bad moment when we were retracing our steps and Torak cried out. It was a howl of utter desolation. Somewhere in his sleep, the dragon god knew that we were taking the orb. He was powerless to stop us, but that shout almost made me jump out of my skin. I don't like being startled like that, which may account for what I did then. Go back to sleep, Torak, I told him. Then I threw his own words back in his teeth. A word of advice for thee, brother of my master, by way of thanks for thine unintended service to me this day. Don't come looking for the orb, my master is very gentle. I'm not. If you come anywhere near the orb, I'll have you for lunch. It was sheer bravado, of course, but I had to say something to him, and my little display of spitefulness may have served some purpose. When he finally did wake up, he was in a state of inarticulate rage, and he wasted a great deal of time punishing the Angrats, who'd been supposed to prevent me from reaching his tower. Ugh. That gave the Aelorns and me a fairly good head start. We crept back down the stairs to the foot of the tower, listening tensely for growlings, but finding only an eerie silence. When we got to the bottom, I looked out into the snowy square. It had remained deserted. My luck was holding. Let's go, Trask said impatiently. Prince Keldar and I had a long discussion about that some years back. And he told me that burglars always suffer from the same impatience, and that it makes getting away almost more dangerous than breaking in. Your natural instinct after you steal something is to take to your heels. But if you don't want to get caught, you'd better suppress that instinct. The residual odor from my encounter with the hounds was still very strong on Torak's doorstep, and the five of us were careful to breathe shallowly until we reached the shelter of that dark alleyway from which we'd emerged when we first got to the square. What do you think? Cherrick whispered as we followed that twisting, smoky alley back toward the city wall. Will it be safe to go back the way we came? I was already working on that, and I hadn't come up with an answer yet. No matter how careful we'd been on our way here from the coast, there were bound to be traces of our passage. I knew Torak well enough to be fairly certain that he wouldn't personally lead the search. He'd leave that to the underlings, and that meant Irvan or Ctuchik, Ctuchik. Based on Belden's description of him, I wasn't particularly worried about Irvan. Ctuchik was an unknown, though. I had no idea what Torak's other disciple was capable of, and this probably wasn't a good time to find out. Going north was obviously out of the question. Torak already had people in place at the land bridge, and I didn't want to have to fight my way through them, assuming we could. Going west was probably quite nearly as dangerous. I had to operate on the theory that Ctuchik could do almost anything I could do, and I'd certainly be able to sense those traces I mentioned before. I didn't even consider going east. There wasn't much point in going deeper into Meloria when safety lay in the other direction. That left only south. Are you gentlemen filling up a bit of a scuffle? I asked Cherrick and his sons. What did you have in mind? Cherrick asked me. Why don't we go pick a fight with the guards at the north gate? I can think of a dozen reasons why we shouldn't, Rilla said dubiously, but I can think of a better one why we should. We don't know how long it's going to be until Torak wakes up, and not going to take the loss of the orb philosophically. As soon as his feet hit the floor, he's going to be organizing a pursuit. That stands to reason, I suppose, Iron Grip conceded. We want those pursuers to go off in the wrong direction if we can possibly arrange it. A pile of dead growlums at the north gate would probably suggest that we went that way, wouldn't you say? It would to me, I guess. Let's go kill some growlums then. Wait a minute, Cherrick objected. If we're going to go back the way we came, we won't want to draw attention to that gate. But we aren't going back the way we came. Which way are we going then? South, actually. Well, southwest would probably be closer. I don't understand. Trust me. He started to swear, evidently hearing that remark irritated him as much as it always irritated me. There were 6 black-robed growlums at the north gate, and we made quick work of them. There were a few muffled cries, of course, and some fairly pathetic groaning, but the fact that there weren't any windows in the houses of Sithol Mishrak kept any people inside from hearing them. All right, Trask said, wiping his bloody axe on a fallen growlum. Now what? Let's go back to your tunnel. Belgarath, he objected. We want to get away from the city. We'll go out through the gate, crawl through your tunnel, and circle around the city until we come to the river on the south side of it. There's a trail outside the wall, Riva pointed out. Why use the tunnel at all? Because the hounds would pick up our scent. We want them to think we've gone north. We'll need some time to get out ahead of them. Very clever, Algar murmured. I don't understand, Drass said. The river's probably frozen, isn't it? Algar asked him. I suppose so. Wouldn't that make it sort of a highway without trees or hills to slow us down? Drass considered it, then comprehension slowly dawned on his big face. You know, Algar, he said, I think you're right. Belgarath is a very clever old man. Do you suppose we could congratulate him some other time? Riva said to them. I'm the only one who's carrying the loot, and I'd like to put some distance between this place and my backside. I saw that I was going to have to rearrange Riva's thinking. Loot wasn't really a proper term to use when he was referring to my master's orb. He hurried out past the sprawled bodies of the gate guards, rounded the bend in the path, and plunged back into the snowbank on the right side. It wasn't too long until we came out of the tunnel at the city wall. There was a sort of beaten pathway in the snow along the outside of the wall where growlums or ordinary Angarax had been patrolling, and we followed that eastward until we reached the corner. Then we turned and followed it south through the drifts toward the river. Altogether, I'd imagine that it took us about 2 hours to reach the river bank. As I'd been fairly sure it would be the frozen river as was clear of snow, it wound like a wide black ribbon through the snow-clogged countryside. That's lucky, Drass noted. We won't leave any tracks. That was sort of the idea, I told him just a bit smugly. How did you know there wouldn't be around 3 feet of snow on top of the ice, he asked me. That blizzard came in out of the west. There's nothing out there in that river for the wind to pile snow up behind. So it swept the ice clean for us. The snow's probably all stacked up against the mountains of western Karanda. You think of everything, don't you, Belgarath? I try. Let's get out on the ice and head down to the coast. I'm starting to get homesick. We rather carefully brushed out the tracks we made going down the riverbank. Then we crossed the ice to the far side to avoid the light of the torches atop the city wall and started downriver. We didn't exactly skate along, but there was a certain amount of sliding. After about 3 hours, the murky clouds hovering over the region began to lighten along the southern horizon. The sun's coming up, Algar noted. Is that going to wake Torak up? I wasn't certain about that. I'll check. Excuse me. I replied. The passenger riding along between my ears had told me not to try to talk to him until we were clear of the city. Well, we were clear now, so I chanced it. Do you want to wake up? I asked. Don't be insulting. I didn't do it on purpose. The question of someone waking up is looming rather large right now. We've got what we came for. Is that the end of this particular event? All caps event. More or less. It's not completely over until you get back across the sea of the east. Can you tell me when Torak's going to wake up? No, you'll know it when it happens. A hint or two would help. Sorry, Belgrath, just keep going. You're doing well so far. Thanks. I didn't say it very graciously. I like the way you dealt with those two hounds. It never would have occurred to me. Where did you come up with the idea? I came out second best in an encounter with a skunk when I was a boy. It's the sort of thing you remember. I can imagine. Keep going and keep your ears open. Then it was gone again. It was perhaps a quarter of an hour later when I found out what he meant by keeping my ears open, although I don't think I would have missed it even if I had been asleep. I'd been asleep. There's a version of the Book of Torak that describes when the dragon god did what the dragon god did when he woke up, and Algar had shrewdly put his finger on what was going to happen. Evidently, a part of the arrangement between the voice in my head and the one in Torak's had been the length of time Torak would remain comatose. Sunrise is a natural transition, and it was then that old One-Eye finally woke up. We were 10 miles away from the city by then, but we could still hear him as he screamed his fury and then wrecked the entire city, even going so far as to knock down his own tower. It was one of the more spectacular temper tantrums in the history of the world. Why don't we run for a while? Algar suggested as the awful sound of the destruction of Sithol Mishrak knocked all the snow off the trees along the riverbank. We are running, Drast told him. Oh, there's a... Oh. Sorry. I tried to pull it away from the thing, from the thing a little while ago, but I wasn't able to. Why don't we run faster? That was when I found out why Algar was called Fleetfoot. Lord, that boy could run. The Book of Aelorn tells the story of what happened there in Lorien. It's a very good story filled with drama, excitement, and mythic significance. I've recited it myself on any number of occasions. It's related to what really happened only by implication. But it's still a good story. That fellow who wrote it was an Aelorn after all, and he overstated the significance of the land bridge. Largely, I suspect, because a pair of Aelorns discovered it. In actuality, I didn't even see the land bridge during that journey, mainly because there were probably several hundred Angrax standing on each one of those rocky islets, waiting for us. We had traveled to Meloria across the frozen sea of the east, and we went back home the same way. Torak's outburst, for which I'll take partial credit since my goading as we were leaving his tower undoubtedly contributed to his rage, completely demoralized the Growlums. Chandon and ordinary Angrax who'd lived in Sithol Mishrak, Belden has since discovered that it was ultimately Shattuchik who restored order with his customary brutality. It still took him several hours, however, and even then our ruse diverted him. The Angrax found the 6 butchered Growlums at the north gate, and Shattuchik sent the hounds off to the north and the west without stopping to consider the possibility of trickery. The day up there didn't last very long, but nightfall didn't slow the Aelorns and me. We followed Algar on downriver, moving as fast as we possibly could. When the sun put in its brief appearance the following day, however, the hounds returned to the ruins of Sithol Mishrak and reported to Tuchik that they'd found no trace of us. That's when Torak's disciple expanded his search. Inevitably, some sharp-nosed hound picked up our scent. Then the chase was on. Tuchik crammed several hundred ordinary Growlums into the shape of hounds, killing about half of them in the process, and that huge, ravening pack came galloping down the river after us. "What are we going to do, Belgrath?" Cherak gasped. "The boys and I are starting to get winded, and I'm not sure how much longer we'll be able to run. I'm going to try something," I told him. "Let's stop and catch our breath here while I work out the details." I went over it in my mind again. Riva had ultimate power tucked inside his tunic, but he wasn't supposed to use it. If my reasoning was correct, though, he wouldn't have to. "All right," I said. "This is how we'll work it. Riva, when those hounds behind us come into sight, I want you to take out the orb and hold it up so they can see it." "I thought you said I wasn't supposed to." "I didn't say you were going to use it. I just told you to hold it up. I want the Chandim to be able to see it, and I want it to be able to see them." "What good's that going to do?" Actually, I wasn't really sure, but I had a strong hunch about what would happen. It'd take too long to explain. Have I been wrong yet? Well, I suppose not. Then you'll just have to trust me when I tell you that I know what I'm doing. I was praying rather fervently that I did, in fact, know what I was doing. It wasn't very long before several dozen hounds came loping around a bend in that frozen river. "All right, Riva," I said, "now's the time. Raise up the orb. Don't give it any orders. Just hold it up. Don't squeeze it. I know how strong your hands are. If you get excited and crush the orb, we're in trouble." "I thought we already were," Cherak muttered somewhere behind me. "I heard that." I threw back over my shoulder at him. Riva sighed and took out the orb and held it over his head. "Goodbye, Father," he said mournfully. The hounds running after us skidded to a stop on the slippery river as they caught sight of the glowing orb in Riva's upraised hand. Then the orb stopped glowing. It flickered and then went dark. Riva groaned. Then the orb woke up again, and it didn't glow blue this time. The light that blazed forth from it was pure white and was about 3 times brighter than the sun. The Chandim fled, howling in pain, stumbling, bumping into each other with their toenails shrieking across the ice. I don't know if any of those Growlums ever regained their sight, but I do know that they were all totally blind when they ran back up the river. "Well," I said with certain astonishment, "what do you know? It worked after all. What an amazing thing." "Belgrath," there was a note of anguish in Cherak's voice. "Are you saying that you didn't know?" "It was theoretically sound," I replied, "but you never really know about theories until you try them out." "What happened?" Drast demanded. I shrugged. "Riva's forbidden to use the orb. That's why the orb permits him to touch it. He couldn't do anything, but the orb could, and it did. The orb doesn't like Torak or the Angaraths. It does like Riva, though. I deliberately put him in danger, and that forced the orb to take matters into its own hands." Doesn't have hands. "It worked out rather well, don't you think?" They stared at me in absolute horror. "Excuse me. Remind me never to play dice with you," Belgrath, Drast said in a trembling voice. "You take too many chances." With Tuchik and Torak both to drive them, more of the hounds came back down the river after us, and a fair number of Growlums as well. They were mounted men following along behind the Growlums, helmeted men in mail shirts and carrying assorted weapons. Those were the first Murgos I ever saw. I didn't like them then, and my opinion of them hasn't improved over the years. Their horses were somewhat bigger than the scrubby little ponies found on the other side of the eastern sea, but the Murgos were still too big for their mounts. All right, I'll be mentioning Murgos and Nadreks and Tholes from time to time as we go along, so I'm going to sort them out for you. The three Angarak tribes that migrated to the western continent after the destruction of Sithol Mishrak were not, in fact, tribes at all. They were all Angaraks, but the almost 2,000 years that they had lived in the city of Endless Night had modified them. The differences between them were not racial nor tribal, but rather were based on class. The word Murgo in Old Angarak meant warrior, the word Nadrak meant townsman, and the word Thol meant peasant or serf. Murgos are built like soldiers, broad-shouldered, narrow-waisted, and generally athletic. Nadraks tend to be leaner. Tholes are built like oxen. Torak had been so intent on trying to subdue the Org that he hadn't paid any attention to what was happening to the inhabitants of Sithol Mishrak as a result of 2,000 years of what might be called selective breeding, and he assumed that they differed from each other because they were in different tribes. That's one of the reasons that the Angarak societies he exported to the west didn't work very well. Murgos felt that work was beneath their dignity. Tholes were too stupid to set up anything even resembling a government, and Nadraks had nobody to swindle but each other. Have you got all that straight? Try to remember it. I don't want to have to go through it all again. I repeat myself often enough as it is. The hounds had been made wary by what happened to their packmates, so they held back while the Murgos and Growlins rushed to the attack. I didn't even have to tell Riva what to do this time. He took out the orb and held it over his head. Once again, the orb flickered and went out. And once again, it took fire. It went a little further this time, however. It was probably the first time in its history that Sithol Mishrak had been fully illuminated, and the western slopes of the Carandes Mountains and the eastern sea as far north as the pole and as far west as the shores of Mournland were engulfed in a light that was at least as bright as the light that reached us at Corim 3,000 years later. The charging Murgos and Growlins were instantly incinerated by that awful light. I discovered something about the orb in that moment. It had a certain innate sense of decency. It warned people before it unleashed its power on them. That's what the blinding of the hounds had been, a warning. There was only one, though. If people chose to ignore the orb's first warning, they didn't get a second. The Aelorns and I were stunned by the enormity of what had just happened. The hounds took advantage of our momentary confusion to circle along the riverbanks to get ahead of us, and that made it possible for them to slow us down. That single flash of brilliant light had temporarily blinded us too, and we floundered along in the darkness after it subsided. Our near blindness, coupled with the periodic suicidal charges of individual hounds, slowed us to the point that we continued downriver at a crawl. How much farther to the coast? Sherrick panted. I have no idea, I admitted. This isn't turning out very well, Balgarath. You worry too much. I turned teary eyes at his youngest son. Keep holding it up in the air, Riva. Let it see what's coming after us. We kept going down the river, our trip punctuated by a series of bright flashes and what sounded like thunderclaps as the orb exploded the hounds that came rushing at us from the riverbanks. They're coming up from behind us, Belgarath. Excuse me, Drash called from the rear. Torax with them. I swore. I hadn't expected this. It's not like the gods to take a hand in these skirmishes. Is he supposed to do that? I threw the question into the echoing vaults of my mind. No, he's not. My passenger sounded suddenly very angry. He's cheating. Does that mean that the rules have been suspended? I think it does. Be careful, though. We don't want to blow up this whole side of the universe. I choked a little on that. Do you want me to do it? Absolutely not. If you take up the orb, it'll attach itself to you and you'll never be able to get rid of it. You'd have to become its guardian, and you don't have time for that. Tell Riva what to do. Don't let him destroy Torak. Whatever happens, he's not the one who's supposed to do that. Cherik, I said sharply, take Dras and Algar. Hold those people back while I talk to Riva. The king of Eloria nodded grimly, and the three of them spread out on the ice. Their weapons ready, the Murgos skirmishes in the forefront of the advancing Angarax got a quick lesson in the virtue of prudence at that point. It's not a good idea to try to attack large Aelorns when they're ready for you. Listen very carefully, Riva, I told Iron Grip. I want you to concentrate on your hand. What? You don't have to understand, just look at the Angarax and think about what you'd like to do to them. But think about your hand at the same time. The orb's a weapon, but you don't have to swing it. Just be aware of it, and it'll do what you want it to do. I thought you said I wasn't supposed to do that, he objected. The rules have changed. The other side's cheating, so we're going to cheat a little too. Don't try to hurt Torak, though. You'll destroy the world if you do. I'll do what? You heard me. Concentrate on obliterating the Angarax instead. Torak's clever enough to get the point eventually. He probably won't cheat again. I'll do what I can. Riva didn't sound too sure of himself. He raised the orb, though, and I could feel his will building as he concentrated on the advancing Angarax, but nothing happened. You've got to release it, I shouted at him. What? You've got the thought right, but you've got to turn it loose. How? Say something. What do I say? I don't care. Try now or burn or kill. Just say something. Go. He said it rather tentatively. I controlled myself with a certain amount of effort. You're giving orders here, Riva, I told him. Don't make it sound like a question. Go, he thundered. It wasn't the word I'd have used, but it turned the trick. The advancing Angarax began exploding. Whole strings of them blew up one another, bright flashes and sharp detonations running in sequence from the riverbank to the other. Cherik's youngest son obliterated the front rank. Then he went back and methodically destroyed the second rank. Then the third. Can't you do more than one at a time, I asked him. Do you want to do this? He demanded from between clenched teeth. No, it's not allowed. Then do you want to shut up and let me do it? Now, do you see how Girion comes by his short temper? Riva was normally the most even-tempered Aelorn I'd ever come across, but you didn't want to irritate him. After he turned the first 5 or 6 ranks of Angarax into puffs of smoke and floating ashes, the rest of them got the message. They turned and fled, giving the raging Torak a wide berth. Torak may have been raging, but I noticed that he was covering his steel-encased face with his remaining hand. He definitely didn't want to lose the other eye. Finally, he even turned and fled, howling. You could turn it off now, I suggested to Riva. I could go after them, he offered eagerly. I could chase down every Angarax on the whole continent. Torak wouldn't have a single worshipper left. Never mind, I told him. You've gone as far as you're supposed to. Put the orb away. Cherik, Dras, and Algar came back. Nice little fight, the king of Eloria noted. That orb's a handy thing to have along, isn't it, Aelorns? It seemed to me that I've said that before. You might as well get used to it. I've been rolling my eyes up at the sky and sighing, Aelorns, for so long now that I don't even know I'm doing it anymore. We went down to the north, to the mouth of the river, and started slogging out across the ice. The hounds were keeping their distance now. Excuse me, but they were still following us. Are they going to be a problem? I asked my friend. Not for long. They'll have to turn back when we get about halfway across. Why? They're Growlums, Belgrath. They don't have any power on your side of the Sea of the East. Zadar did. That's because he's a disciple. Different rules apply to disciples. Satuchik or Irvan could keep coming, but ordinary Growlums can't. Why not? Belden explained it to you once, remember? Oh, now that you mention it, I guess I do. Growlums don't have any power in a place where there aren't any Angaraks. Amazing, you remembered after all. What now? Pick up one foot and put it in front of the other one. I'll let you decide which foot. Don't try to pick them both up at the same time, though. Very funny. We continued across that awful broken sea ice for the next couple of days with the hounds still not too far behind us. There was no boundary line out there, of course, but I knew when we had reached the halfway point because the hounds suddenly broke off their pursuit. They lined up along an ice ridge and sat howling in frustration. Our luck's still holding, I told the Alorns. How's that? Cherik asked me. That's as far as the hounds can come. We're home free now. That turned out to be premature because suddenly there was a hound directly in front of us. A hound twice the size of the ones howling behind us. It seemed to emanate a reddish glow. Don't bother, I told Riva as his hand dug into the neck of his tunic. The dog's an illusion. It's not really there. You haven't heard the last of this, Balgarath, the monstrous creature growled at me, seeming almost to chew on the words with his long fangs. You would be Irvan, I said calmly, or possibly Satuchik. I'll let you worry about that. You and I are going to meet again, old man. You've got my promise on that. You've won this time. Next time, you won't be so lucky. And then it vanished. And chapter 16 is next with some artwork. Good night. I enjoyed reading to you. I love you. Bye.